Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, and thank you so much for joining today's program. Now, we all probably think there's just one election taking place in 2024, and that happens to be one in November. But actually, on June 2nd, Mexico will be going to the polls to elect a new head of state, and it's going to be very important for both of our countries. With the two presumptive candidates being female, the future president will, for the first time, most likely be a woman. And that's really a remarkable step for our southern neighbor, who is known as a country that is somewhat machismo. U.S. relations with Mexico, though, are like really living with a teenager. There are good days and there are bad days. But underscoring our closeness, just a few months ago, last year for the first time in over 2 decades, Mexico surpassed China, becoming the largest trade partner with the United States. Today, to explore and discuss what we might expect over the coming months, let's welcome our two guests. Joining us from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. is Duncan Wood. He's been a scholar of Mexican politics and U.S.-Mexican relations for over a quarter of a century. And he's lived and worked in Mexico for 17 years before moving to Washington, where he ran the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. Dr. Wood is currently Vice President of Strategy and New Initiatives, and he's a Senior Advisor to the Mexico Institute. Here in the studio is Xavier Medina Vidal. Welcome. Great to have you with us here. He is the Director for the Center of Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington, and his primary areas of research include Mexican politics, migration, and North American integration. So as I said, this really is an important election coming up for Mexico. And why are the stakes so high, Duncan?
I think a number of reasons. One, as you mentioned, the importance of this bilateral relationship for the United States. Mexico has become increasingly and deeply integrated with the U.S. economy. And of course, we also see the social ties that exist because of migration in both directions. We now have more than 1 million U.S. citizens living in Mexico, as well as all of the Mexicans and Mexican Americans or Americans of Mexican origin living here in the United States. But for Mexico as a country, I think this election matters for one very obvious reason, which is that in 2018, when President Andrés Manuel López Obrador won the election, he put in place what he calls the fourth transformation of Mexico, an ambitious program to revolutionize public life, to reestablish what he called a more moral and ethical approach to politics. And he's had limited success in establishing that fourth transformation of Mexico over the past 6 years. And now we're going to see whether his chosen successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, the former mayor of Mexico City, is going to be able to win the election and carry on that transformation and to see how far it can be taken. For the opposition political parties who were in power for so long before the 2018 election, this is very much an existential question. If they can't do well in this election, and by that I mean not just winning, but really reestablishing themselves as a force in congressional politics and at the gubernatorial level across the country, then their future is far from assured. So I think there's a lot at stake this time around, Jim.
So I want to get into more detail about who the two candidates are, but one of the things that's so different about Mexico, especially in this upcoming election, is we're not just talking about the office of the president, but there's some, over 20,000 positions that are going to be up for vote.
Yes, and that includes the Chamber of Deputies, and the Senate. In Mexico, there are 500 deputies, equivalent to the House of Representatives, and 128 senators. Something that's also interesting, in addition to these elections that are happening within Mexico, is the vote abroad. So Mexico also has representation for migrants, for those of us Mexicans and Mexican Americans living abroad, and those are also on the ballot. Deputies and a senator that will be on the ballot.
Duncan, tell us about the two candidates, just real briefly. You mentioned Sheinbaum having formerly been the mayor of Mexico City, but who is her opponent?
Well, Xochitl Gálvez is a truly compelling political figure, raised in poverty to an indigenous family in Mexico. As a child, the famous story about her is that she used to make gelatin desserts that her mother would sell in the traffic as a way to support the family. She came from an abusive family background. Her father was an alcoholic who was highly abusive, but she managed to really pull herself up by the bootstraps, got herself a fantastic education by working hard, leaving home, going to live in the big city, working while she was studying, and became a very successful businesswoman eventually, was able to support her family, and ultimately entered into politics. And that story of personal transformation is a compelling one, particularly in the era that we're in Mexico, where the current president, López Obrador, tells people that they shouldn't aspire to be too great. They shouldn't try to chase after money or success. They should be happy with the way that things are. She is a charismatic figure. And I think that, once we put her firmly on the campaign trail against Claudia Sheinbaum, then we're going to see quite a contrast in their personalities.
Because everything that I've read, it looks like Claudia Sheinbaum is a shoo-in to win. Do you disagree? I mean, you think there's a possibility that Galvez has a shot?
I think she has a shot. It's going to be an uphill struggle. I think there's, as you say, you look at the polls today, and there is an incredibly strong lead on the part of Claudia Sheinbaum. And once we see how they perform on stage, Xochitl Galvez, as I said, is charismatic. She's quick on her feet. She's smart. Claudia Sheinbaum is very, very intelligent. She's a solid political leader, but she lacks that same kind of charisma that Galvez has. And so once we see them side by side on stage, I feel that may be the possibility for an opening for Xochitl Galvez.
Do you see any difference between the two of how they might approach the United States?
Let me just say that, to agree with Duncan, to add to what Duncan is saying, I think what folks will be looking for in terms of a game changer that might change the outcome or the polls would be to see how much Sheinbaum distances herself or not from López Obrador, because that's one of her main the main critiques of her is that she's just a replica of López Obrador in many senses, in her rhetoric and in the way she even addresses the public. And I want to add that Xochitl Galvez is largely a creation of Obrador, because her rise to popularity was largely a function of daily attacks in the president's morning conference, La Mañanera, was attacking Xochitl Galvez. He does this a lot. He sets up anyone who opposes him as a conservative, as an opposition, as against the transformation, and she was one of his main targets for a while, and that led to her rise in popularity. In terms of their positions on the United States, I will say, as someone who follows this issue in terms of the migration issue, in terms of U.S.-Mexico relations as it relates to the migration issue, neither candidate has really come forward with an agenda. They're sort of shopping around for particular alliances to form with migrant groups here in the United States, but neither Xochitl Galvez and especially Sheinbaum doesn't have a reason, because of the lead that she has and the popularity of Morena. They don't have such a strong incentive to seek out the migrant vote. So that's where I have a little bit of trouble with both candidates.
What are the polls showing now?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of variation, but essentially we're looking at a 20-point lead for Claudia Sheinbaum at this point in time. But as I say, that may be soft. The undecided vote can kick in. There may be some redistribution of votes. There's also a phenomenon that a number of commentators have brought up, which is that because Morena, Claudia Sheinbaum's party, is the current government, when people are asked who they will vote for, they may feel that they're being pressured to say that they support the current administration. And, even though it's done confidentially, etc. And that may result ultimately in a number of people changing their actual vote on voting day. However, I have to say this, the Morena party under López Obrador has been very, very successful in exercising a form of clientelism by which they have increased the minimum wage many times. They have increased cash transfers from the federal government to people in various different levels of need across society. The president himself is very popular because he adopts a populist rhetoric, and he has managed to control the national conversation for 6 years through his morning press conference, what he calls La Mañanera. And he basically has set the political agenda every single day throughout his presidency. And people like him. They associate with him. They feel that he's one of them. And that's something that Mexican voters haven't had for a long time. And so that popularity really does carry over to who people see as his chosen successor.
But when you look at his legacy, I mean, how successful has he been on some of the really critical issues, such as the cartels, crime? I mean, how do you see it?
So I see him as successful in terms of being a populist and garnering that support, especially from older voters, Mexicans, and those with less education. He is greatly popular. He's built an agenda around social programs and massive infrastructure programs that have been in the pipeline for a while. There was a lot of controversy over canceling the construction of a halfway built airport in Mexico City that he canceled because that was his predecessor.
That was very early in his term.
Very early in his term, yes. And now there's already the IFA airport quite a ways away from the city. His daily message is corruption, and he talks about corruption. He talks about how the conservatives are the corrupt ones, how he and his government are not corrupt. He brings that into the daily conversation in terms of setting the agenda, and he is very adept at entirely ignoring the question of violence and the cartels. He's been quite dismissive, actually, of that particular issue, violence against the journalists. So journalists are highly at risk in Mexico. Any journalist who sort of goes against Morena, who goes against the president and what he's saying, there's been some evidence, and there's been, I forget.
Oh, how many journalists have been killed or missing? I mean, it's a very large number.
Hundreds, at least hundreds. I saw the count yesterday. Article 19 has the exact figure, but it's hundreds in the last several years. So that's a major concern. Well, he wants to talk about corruption. He wants to ignore the cartels, the violence, and the killings, the disappearances. So that's one
of the things I wanted to ask. In the article in which you were quoted in the Dallas Morning News, which appeared relatively recently, one of the reasons that the consulates, which are located really throughout the United States, I don't know how many consulates Mexico has in the United States, but it's got to be dozens.
It's 51 or 50.
50. I mean, that's enormous. Is because Mexican citizens, or those who have dual nationality, are uncomfortable about going back to Mexico to vote. And just across the border from Laredo, I think you said in this article that there were like 14,000 people that are missing.
Right.
I mean, what is it? Just people being held up for ransom and they're not paying, and then they disappear, or what's the story there?
A lot of that has to do with one of the newer phenomena. It relates to the coyotes. They basically, so the cartels have taken over, established a monopoly of you're going to cross the border with our people, basically, and if you don't do that, if you don't use our service, we'll say, for lack of a better term, then we know we're going to.
So you're seeing the coyotes that are.
Yeah.
Right.
So the same drug cartels have taken over that business as well.
Duncan, do we see any difference in the two candidates about how they would address drug trafficking and specifically fentanyl?
Yes, I think so. I mean, really, you have Xochitl Gálvez out there saying that this is a problem, we need to address it. When Gálvez was with us at the Wilson Center just over a week ago, she talked about the fentanyl scourge. She talked about the fact that this is a problem that needs to be approached together by the United States and Mexico. She's really identifying, violence and drugs and organized crime as one of the major challenges for Mexico. She makes this draws this comparison where she says, imagine if you lived in a country, here in the United States, where the oranges that you buy from Florida have all been connected to organized crime, where you can't drive a truck from Houston or Dallas up to Detroit without having to pay a rite of passage to organized crime. And she says, this is one of the major challenges for the next government. Shinebound, by contrast, really is just on a message of continuity. We're going to continue with what the current president has been doing. We believe that his approach to organized crime, which is, famously he is called abrazos no balazos, hugs not bullets, has been successful. Crime in general has continued to pick up. And this presidency of López Obrador is the bloodiest presidency on record.
So I want to talk a bit more about the economic integration that I mentioned at the beginning of the program. So U.S. trade with Mexico surges to #1 position. We have this graphic that we're going to show on the screen. Is this largely a result of the de-risking, decoupling of China, our U.S. relationship with China, and nearshoring?
I think they're all. It's related. So related to the relationship bilateral with trade relationship with China, but keep in mind that Mexico and the United States and Canada have been building an infrastructure of trade for decades, and so this is an issue. This is the product of a lot of work that's been put into establishing these relationships and establishing these supply chains. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but the trends, sort of the payoffs, are sort of being realized now. So it's been a long time coming.
Does this create, Duncan, a real opportunity? We talk about the Belt and Road Initiative with China. Is there a way for this to extend to create much better relations with Central America, even going down farther south?
The nearshoring phenomenon is fascinating to observe. It has really saved the López Obrador presidency in terms of its economic record. Without nearshoring, there's no doubt that Mexico would have grown a lot less over this 6-year period. And most people, myself included, say that Mexico is growing and attracting this foreign investment despite or in spite of López Obrador, rather than because of him. The question of whether it can extend further south is tricky. Right now, the infrastructure doesn't exist really to fully integrate Central American economies into that. But there's a fascinating project which is underway in the south of Mexico, which is called the Trans-Isthmus Link, or the Interoceanic Corridor, which is a rail connection across the narrowest part of Mexico, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Joining two ports, one on the side of the Gulf of Mexico, another one on the Pacific, which is designed now to be a challenger to the Panama Canal. And many people have talked about this. In fact, the idea goes back to President Porfirio Diaz in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But López Obrador has actually made it happen. Now, if this is a success, and there is a good chance that it will be successful given the current problems of the Panama Canal due to climate change and low water levels, then we could see a new kind of economic development taking place in that southern part of Mexico. They still need to bring in reliable, clean energy. They still need to build out the infrastructure around it. But that could provide a little node of economic growth that could then begin to extend further south. I think it certainly will be a magnet for certain kinds of investment, and of course for migration from Central America as well. If you can then take it to the next level, you bring in natural gas into that part of Mexico and run those pipelines south into Central America, all of a sudden you could have the energy that you need for an economic takeoff of some parts of that region.
You recently wrote a white paper about, challenges and recommendations. They published this at the Wilson Center, and one of the issues that you talked about that's really critical is water. Of course, that's an issue for us in the Southwest. How serious of a problem is it for Mexico, especially when you're talking about economic development?
You think about the problems that Mexico faces with climate change in general. It is it's right there in the danger zone next to the Gulf of Mexico. It has tropical, subtropical areas. It has deserts. You're seeing already migration that's being forced migration because of climate change. People no longer able to grow the crops that they need. But most importantly, I think on the water issue, we have seen up in the north of the country, water become a hot political potato that is being tossed around. Number one, because of the question of water rights up by the border and whether or not Mexico and the United States can sort out their relationship over water. And number two, because a lot of people are really being forced now to find a different kind of livelihood because the water isn't there. Number three, because, and we saw this in the case of Constellation Brands, a brewery that was being built up in Mexicali to export beer to the United States, was shut down by President López Obrador because he said, essentially, you're stealing water from an area of Mexico which desperately needs it. Didn't matter that they had all the right permits and everything. Ultimately, López Obrador, as president, was able to shut that project down. And, you know, it's becoming an issue in this election. And it's even an issue, a big issue now for Mexico City. Mexico City does not have access to the amount of water that it needs, partly because infrastructure projects haven't been implemented and we really haven't done enough forward planning to make sure that Mexico has enough water to sustain economic development.
That's interesting that the president had the ability and that much power to be able to do it. The Mexican president, I've heard, really has more power, the ability to affect change than the U.S. president.
Yes, and that's a legacy of the presidencialismo. One of the legacies of Mexican politics is a very strong executive relative to the legislative and judicial branches, and something that Obrador has done, or at least attempted to do. He's had limited success in centralizing even more power for the executive, for the president, and that's a concern. That's an issue that folks are thinking about as they go into these elections as well. A lot of just recently there was a huge manifestation or a protest. I don't know the number. Hundreds of thousands of people showed up to support basically the defense of the National Electoral Institute. That's one. And a lot of the independent institutions like the Institution for Transparency, Human Rights, a lot of these independent institutions that are sort of quasi-governmental but have long been independent. He's going after those institutions and wanting to either dismantle them entirely or reform them to the point where they're just completely irrelevant and basically to consolidate more authority, more power.
That sounds like a real step away
executive.
from democracy.
It is, and it is a concern, quite a big concern. I think for a lot of the maybe infrastructure successes that he's had, you know, he's also been very successful, so to speak, at dismantling and attacking. From day one of his presidency, he went after universities and these independent institutions.
Well, one thing that you said a few minutes ago, Duncan, you know, and I'm seeing that Obrador is really charismatic. And what's so interesting about Mexican politics is one term and you're out. And typically, former Mexican politics, Vidal, you know this, they seem that they go to Yale or another U.S. university and be a visiting professor and make money on the lecture tour. Obrador has his hand-picked successor. Do you think he's going to drift away or still play a role?
It's a fascinating question, Jim. Throughout his presidency, he has said that he would not seek to change the Constitution so that he could be reelected. As it turned out, he didn't actually ever have that option because the midterm elections proved to be so disappointing for him. He has said that when his term is up, he will go off to his rancho and retire. But the question is, what does he do from his rancho? And the fact is that he has enjoyed using the bully pulpit of the national media for the last 6 years. I doubt very much that he will fade off into the sunset. I suspect that he will maintain a platform from his retirement where he will feel free to criticize or endorse the next president of Mexico. And that will matter a great deal because of his popularity. If the next president of Mexico doesn't do things that he agrees with, then that could be highly problematical for them, including for Claudia Sheinbaum, even though that she is, you know, his chosen successor. If she suddenly changes course and decides to enact a more independent, autonomous presidency from López Obrador, I have no doubt that he will jump back into the ring.
But let's remind our audience, when you say jump back into the ring, he cannot jump back into the presidential ring, unlike what we're seeing in the United States.
Correct.
Absolutely. Not back into the electoral ring, but certainly into the political circus.
I have just a little bit of time left. I want to ask you, Do Mexicans care whether it's President Trump or President Biden is our next president here in 2025?
So I think that's an interesting question, because in terms of economics, in terms of trade with the United States, Mexico has done better under Republican administrations. Socially, of course, Mexicans defend their sovereignty very, very, very fervently, and of course the things that Trump says about migrants, about immigrants,
massive deportation,
Mexicans,
sending in the military,
all the threats that I think that folks should be taking seriously as more than just threats. Of course, that does not set well, but also the Democrats and Biden have not been all that successful in their attempts to regularize the migrant community. So it's a toss-up. I think there's a preference for, as we see obviously with Obrador. There's some comparisons there to be made with Trump, right, in terms of his populism, his appeal, and as Duncan was saying, he can very much wield influence from outside. Even
Got
if
just
even
a
if,
few
even
more
if Claudia's
seconds,
there.
and I do want to ask Duncan this question.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. USMCA, which was the successor to NAFTA, stable?
Gosh, we'll see in 2026 when the 6-year review begins. But honestly, I think that any objective observer would say that up to this point it's been successful. It has delivered the goods for both Mexico and the United States, and of course for Canada. Without the USMCA, even with the nearshoring phenomenon, Mexico wouldn't have done so well. Now, there will be complaints. There will be people who say that they are not doing well. And we'll see what the next president of the United States, whoever that may be, what they will say about the USMCA. I do expect that we will see negotiations over potential changes or additions to USMCA coming up in 2026.
Well, I think, when we're talking about international affairs, there's often not a lot of good news, and I take what you just said as somewhat positive, so I appreciate it. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on today's program, where we talk about things that matter with people who care. Have a great day.